She spent $2 million and 5 years watching men in white lab coats plug laptops into a 1957 Ferrari, pretending they understood its soul. They didn't. The machine was dead. It took a man who swept up cigarette butts and smelled of ammonia to make the engine scream again. The garage was located 6 stories beneath the street level of downtown Seattle. It was a concrete vault, climate-controlled to a constant, sterile 68 degrees. Massive HEPA filters hummed in the ceiling, scrubbing the air of dust, moisture, and life. The floor was coated in a brilliant, reflective white epoxy that looked less like a parking surface and more like the floor of a semiconductor manufacturing plant. In the exact center of this sprawling, empty cavern sat a 1957 Ferrari 250 Testa Rossa. Margot Hayes sat in the driver's seat. Her hands, manicured and perfectly still, gripped the large, wooden steering wheel. She was 42 years old, the CEO of a global logistics empire that moved billions of tons of freight across the oceans. She controlled satellites in low Earth orbit. She dictated the schedules of 80,000 employees. She knew, down to the millimeter, where a shipping container of microchips was at any given second in the Pacific. Yet, she could not make 12 cylinders of Italian aluminum fire in sequence. The car smelled like a tomb of spent adrenaline. It was a heavy, intoxicating blend of aged horsehair stuffing from the cracked leather seats, hot oil, and the sharp, metallic tang of leaded racing fuel. It was an offensive smell in the modern world. Margot loved it. It was the only thing in her life that felt entirely untamed. She turned the small metal key in the ignition. She pushed the starter button. The starter motor whined, a high, desperate, grinding sound, before the engine caught. When it did, the noise was violent, a pure mechanical explosion echoing off the concrete walls. The V12 engine didn't purr. It idled with an erratic, aggressive clatter, like a box of wrenches being shaken. It sounded angry. Margot checked her watch. She rested her foot gently on the throttle, bringing the revolutions up to a steady 2,000. The temperature gauge on the dashboard slowly began its climb. For 19 minutes, the car was a masterpiece. The exhaust note was a ragged, glorious roar. Then at minute 20, the engine block hit 210 degrees. Margot pushed the throttle deeper. 3,000 RPM. 4,000. Cough. A hollow, choking sound emanated from beneath the long, red hood. The RPM needle fluttered. Margot kept her foot planted, her jaw tightening. Spit, clatter. The engine hesitated, starved, and then, with a pathetic, wheezing sigh, it died. The silence that rushed back into the garage was deafening. The only sound was the tink, tink, tink of the exhaust manifolds cooling down. Margot closed her eyes. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just sat there in the heavy silence, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white, her fingernails biting into the polished wood. 5 years. $2.1 million. She had shipped the car back to Maranello, Italy, twice. She had paid a team of ex-Formula One mechanics a retainer of $30,000 a month just to stare at it. They had arrived with racks of diagnostic laptops, laser thermometers, and ultrasonic sensors. They had mapped the thermal dynamics of the engine bay. They had custom-machined new carburetors out of aerospace-grade billet aluminum. They had rewired the ignition system using materials designed for the aerospace industry. None of it worked. Every mechanic, every engineer, every supposed genius she threw money at eventually gave her the same apologetic shrug. They blamed the vintage casting. They blamed the modern fuel mixtures. They printed out reams of data, colorful graphs showing torque curves and fuel atomization rates as if a spreadsheet could excuse their failure. The money didn't matter. To Margot, $1 billion was an abstract concept, but the failure mattered. The failure was a physical weight on her chest. She had built her entire life, her entire ruthless career, on the premise that any problem could be solved if you applied enough capital and enough leverage. This car was mocking her. It was a beautifully sculpted $2 million middle finger to her worldview. She opened the door and stepped out onto the pristine white epoxy. She slammed the door shut. The metallic clack echoed through the vault. She didn't bother putting a cover on it. Let it sit there in the cold air, broken and useless. She walked toward the private elevator, her heels clicking a sharp, angry rhythm against the floor. It was 2:14 a.m. on a Wednesday. The city above was drowning in a heavy, unrelenting Pacific Northwest rainstorm. Margot couldn't sleep. Her brain was caught in an endless loop of supply chain bottlenecks and quarterly projections. But underneath all that noise was the phantom sound of the Ferrari dying at 4,000 RPM. She took the private elevator down to the garage. She wore a pair of loose grey sweatpants and a dark, heavy cashmere sweater. In her right hand, she carried a heavy crystal tumbler filled with 2 fingers of mezcal. It tasted like smoke and wet dirt. She didn't come down to work on the car. She came down to glare at it, to remind herself that she was fallible. The elevator doors slid silently open. Margot stepped out and froze. The garage wasn't empty. The smell hit her first. It was harsh and institutional. Pine sol and industrial floor wax. It cut violently through the lingering scent of gasoline and old leather. A man was standing next to the Ferrari. He had propped the hood open. He was leaning over the driver's side fender, staring down into the labyrinth of the engine bay. Margot felt a sudden, ugly spike of territorial rage. The garage was restricted, keycard access only, locked down by a private security firm. "Step away from the aluminum," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the hum of the air scrubbers like a razor. The man didn't jump. He didn't flinch. He slowly stood up from his leaning position and turned to look at her. He was in his late 60s, maybe older. Lean, with narrow, sloped shoulders and a posture that suggested a lifetime of looking down at floors. He wore faded grey coveralls. Over his left breast pocket, a frayed patch read Apex Facilities. Next to him, parked precariously close to the multi-million-dollar vehicle, was a scarred yellow mop bucket on squeaky caster wheels. He wiped his hands on a greasy grey rag. His hands were thick, the knuckles heavily scarred. The skin around his fingernails was permanently stained with dark oil that looked like it had been there since the 1990s. "Step back," Margot repeated, closing the distance between them. Her eyes darted to the flawless red paint of the fender, looking for scratches, for smudges, for any sign that this janitor had damaged the only thing she actually cared about. "Your number 3 carburetor is running lean," the man said. His voice was gravelly, quiet. He didn't sound defensive. He sounded bored. Margot stopped 10 feet away. She stared at him, the mezcal burning a slow trail down her throat. She let out a dry, incredulous laugh. "Excuse me?" The man, his name tag read T. Finch, pointed the handle of a flathead screwdriver toward the engine. "Smelled it from the elevator bank. Gas leaves a shadow when it's burning wrong. Smells sharp, like sour metal. You're running hot on the left bank." Margot felt a flush of anger heat her neck. "The car hasn't run in 3 days. You cannot smell a lean mixture on a cold engine." Finch shrugged, tossing the rag onto the rim of his mop bucket. "Suit yourself, lady. It's your paperweight." He grabbed the handle of the mop bucket and turned to walk away. "Wait," Margot snapped. Finch stopped, looking back over his shoulder. Margot took a step forward. The sheer arrogance of this man, this floor sweeper, irritated her beyond reason. "I have spent $2 million on that engine. I have flown in men from Stuttgart and Maranello, men with PhDs in fluid dynamics. They hooked that engine up to telemetry systems that track data points at 1,000 frames a second." "Yeah," Finch said. "I saw 'em." "You saw them?" "Hard to miss. Bunch of guys in clean shirts pacing around, looking at laptops." Finch leaned against the handle of his mop. "Computers don't know how to breathe, lady. They only know how to count. A machine like that, it ain't digital. It's just air, fire, and fuel. It's meat and bones. You can't read a spark plug with a spreadsheet." Margot stared at him. The sheer absurdity of the moment washed over her. Here she was, one of the most powerful women in North America, being lectured on mechanical engineering by a man who smelled like bleach. "You think you know better than the engineers at Ferrari?" she asked, her voice dripping with venom. "I think engineers build things to work on the paper," Finch said, calmly. "Mechanics make them work in the dirt." Margot took a sip of her mezcal. The alcohol fueled a reckless, impulsive thought. It was the same kind of thought that led her to launch hostile takeovers of rival companies. "Fix it," she said. Finch blinked. "What?" "You heard me. Fix it." Margot pointed at the engine bay. "You have until Friday. If you scratch the paint, I will track down whatever miserable pension you're relying on, and I will bankrupt you in court just for the sport of it." Finch looked at her. He didn't look intimidated. He looked at her with a mild, pitying expression that infuriated her even more. "If I fix it," Finch said, "I don't want your money." Margot sneered. "Everyone wants my money." "What do you want?" Finch patted the side of his yellow mop bucket. "I want a new bucket. The front left wheel on this one squeaks. Drives me crazy." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and pushed the bucket toward the service corridor. The squeak of the bad wheel echoed off the concrete, a rhythmic, mocking sound, leaving Margot standing alone with her broken car. Margot cancelled her Friday morning board meeting. She pushed back a conference call with the Port Authority of Los Angeles. At 8:00 a.m., she sat on a black folding chair near the wall of the underground garage, wearing a sharp, tailored blazer over a t-shirt, nursing a cup of black coffee. She was waiting for the punchline. She was waiting for Thomas Finch to realize he was out of his depth, to fail just like the men in the white lab coats had failed. She wanted him to fail. She needed him to fail to validate the $2 million she had already spent. At 8:05 a.m., the service elevator dinged. Finch walked out. He wasn't pushing a mop bucket today. He carried a faded, olive-green canvas tool bag that looked like military surplus. It slumped heavily against his leg as he walked. He didn't say good morning. He just walked up to the Ferrari, set the bag down on the epoxy floor with a dull thud, and unzipped it. The bag smelled faintly of brass polish and old grease. "Keys," he said, holding out a hand. Margot walked over and dropped the keys into his palm. His skin was rough, like heavy grit sandpaper. Finch slid into the driver's seat. He didn't marvel at the wooden steering wheel. He didn't stroke the leather. He treated the car like a tractor. He pumped the gas pedal twice, turned the key, and hit the starter. The V12 erupted. The noise was instantly overwhelming in the enclosed space. Margot reached into her pocket and pushed a pair of foam earplugs into her ears. Finch didn't wear earplugs. He let the car idle, the violent clatter bouncing off the walls. He got out, leaving the door open, and walked to the engine bay. He didn't pull out a laptop. He didn't attach any sensors. He reached into his canvas bag and pulled out a simple wooden dowel rod. It was about 2 feet long, stained dark with age and oil. Margot watched, her brow furrowing. A stick. He brought a stick. Finch leaned over the vibrating, incredibly hot engine block. He pressed one end of the wooden dowel against the metal casing of the first cylinder bank and pressed the other end firmly against the tragus of his ear. He closed his eyes. He was using it as a mechanic's stethoscope, listening to the mechanical heartbeat of the engine. For 20 minutes, he moved the dowel around. He touched it to the valve covers, the water pump, the intake manifolds. The garage grew blisteringly hot. The air scrubbers kicked into overdrive, trying to pull the heavy exhaust fumes out of the room. Margot's eyes began to sting from the unburnt hydrocarbons. Sweat beaded on Finch's forehead, dripping down his nose, but he didn't wipe it away. He kept his eyes closed, listening to the metal. The temperature gauge on the dash crept past 200 degrees. Margot leaned forward in her chair. Here it comes, she thought. Finch reached through the open window and pushed the throttle linkage by hand. The RPMs spiked. 3,000, 4,000. The engine screamed. Then, the hesitation. Cough. Finch didn't let off the throttle. He kept it pinned at 4,000. Spit. Clatter. The engine gasped, choked on its own intake, and violently died. The sudden silence was heavy. Margot pulled her earplugs out. She felt a grim sense of satisfaction. "See?" she said, her voice echoing. "It starves. The fuel mapping is wrong, or the carburetors are boiling the gas." Finch didn't look at her. He set the wooden dowel down on the cowl. "Fuel ain't boiling," he muttered. He reached into his bag and pulled out a heavy, tarnished steel wrench. It wasn't metric. It was an old, imperial wrench. He leaned deep into the engine bay, ignoring the searing heat radiating off the exhaust headers. He didn't look at the massive, complex Weber carburetors. He looked down beneath them, tracing the braided steel fuel line backward toward the firewall. "You're fancy engineers," Finch said. His voice strained as he wedged his arm past a hot coolant pipe. "They replaced all the fittings, didn't they?" "Everything was upgraded," Margot said defensively. "Aerospace-grade beryllium copper alloys, heat-resistant up to 1,000 degrees. Finch grunted. There was a sharp, metallic clink as he tapped the wrench against a joint in the fuel line. "That's your problem right there," he said, pulling his arm out. He wiped a smudge of grease off his cheek, leaving a grey smear. Margot walked over, looking down into the dense packaging of the engine bay. "The alloy, that's the highest quality material available." "It's too rigid," Finch said. He pointed with the tip of his wrench. The original fittings were brass. Brass is soft. It gives a little. You got a V12 engine here. At 4,000 RPM, it creates a specific harmonic vibration. It shakes. All engines shake. Yeah, but this one shakes at a frequency that your new Aerospace alloy hates, Finch explained, looking at her like she was a slow student. The rigid fitting doesn't flex with the vibration. It pulls. When the engine block expands from the heat and the vibration hits that specific frequency at 4,000 RPM, it pulls the joint apart just a fraction of a millimeter. Margot stared at the fitting. And it sucks in air, Finch said. It pulls a microscopic bubble of air into the fuel line. The air bubble travels up, hits the heat of the manifold, expands, and vapor locks the line. It starves the float bowl. Your laptops couldn't see it because it only happens under physical load, at a specific heat and a specific harmonic resonance. A computer just reads the stall. Margot was silent. She looked at the tiny, innocent-looking metal joint. 5 years. "Can you fix it?" she asked, her voice losing its usual hard edge. Finch reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small roll of ugly, fibrous heat tape and a dirty brass fitting that looked like it belonged on a garden hose. "Got this off an old Ford tractor a few years back. Thread pitch is a match." He went to work. It was crude. It was barbaric. He unthreaded the $10,000 bespoke alloy fitting and tossed it onto the pristine epoxy floor where it clattered away. He threaded the dirty brass fitting into place, tightened it with a grunt, and wrapped the line heavily in the ugly heat tape to dampen the vibration. 50 cents of material. "Start it," he said, wiping his hands on his coveralls. Margot hesitated. She walked around to the driver's seat. She slid in. The leather felt different this time. Less like a tomb, more like a waiting animal. She turned the key. The engine fired instantly. She didn't wait for it to idle. She pushed the throttle down. The noise slammed into the concrete walls. 3,000 RPM. The temperature was already high. 4,000 RPM. Margot held her breath. Her foot was steady on the pedal. The tachometer needle hovered exactly at the 4,000 mark. She waited for the cough. She waited for the hollow, choking sound. The V12 just screamed. It was a wall of pure, unbroken mechanical fury. It didn't stutter. It didn't hesitate. It breathed. She pushed it harder. 5,000 RPM. 6,000. The steering wheel vibrated violently in her hands, numbing her fingers. The engine roared, alive and angry, burning fuel and air with perfect, violent rhythm. She slowly lifted her foot off the gas. The revs dropped, settling into a low, menacing idle. Margot sat in the seat, her chest heaving slightly. She looked through the windshield. Thomas Finch was already zipping up his canvas tool bag. He picked it up by the handles, slung it over his shoulder, and began walking toward the service elevator. He didn't look back to see if she was impressed. He didn't care. Margot sat in her glass-walled office on the 52nd floor. The city spread out beneath her like a shimmering, wet circuit board. From this height, Seattle was silent. The triple-paned acoustic glass filtered out the sirens, the traffic, the friction of 3 million people grinding through their Friday afternoons. She held a heavy crystal glass of sparkling water. The ice clinked against the rim. It was a sharp, sterile sound. On her desk sat a cashier's check for $100,000. She stared at the bank logo printed in the top left corner. 100,000 was a rounding error in her daily operational budget. It meant nothing to her, but it was enough to alter the trajectory of a man sweeping floors. She hated owing debts. A debt was a loose thread. It was an unbalanced equation. For 48 hours, she had tried to ignore the fact that a man named Thomas Finch had solved a problem that had humiliated her for 5 years. He had done it with a piece of scrap brass and an old stick, and he had walked away without asking for a dime. The transaction was incomplete. It was festering in her mind like a splinter. At 6 p.m., she left the office. She didn't take her driver. She didn't call her assistant. She took the freight elevator down into the bowels of the building, past the executive parking levels, down into the sub-basement where the concrete was unpainted and the air smelled heavily of ozone, hot dust, and burnt microwave popcorn. She found the door marked Facilities and Maintenance. She pushed it open without knocking. The room was lit by 2 flickering fluorescent tubes that cast a sick, greenish pallor over everything. The walls were lined with grey metal lockers. In the center of the room sat a dented folding table covered in a layer of fine grit. Thomas Finch was sitting in a plastic chair, eating half of a bruised red apple. He held a small folding pocket knife, methodically peeling the skin off the fruit in one long, unbroken ribbon. A tiny, battery-powered radio on the table was playing a crackly broadcast of a minor league baseball game. He didn't look up when the heavy door banged shut behind her. Margot walked to the table. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than Finch made in 6 months. Her heels clicked sharply against the raw concrete. She stopped at the edge of the table and slapped the cashier's check down next to his radio. The paper fluttered slightly as it settled. Finch finished peeling his apple slice. He popped it into his mouth, chewed slowly, and finally looked at the piece of paper. He read the numbers. His expression didn't change. He didn't widen his eyes. He didn't gasp. He just looked at it the way a man looks at a piece of junk mail. "You left this blank on the pay to the order of line," he said. "Fill it in," Margot said. Her voice was tight, commanding. "Consider it a consulting fee." Finch picked up the check. He pinched it between his scarred thumb and forefinger. The grease, permanently embedded in his skin, immediately left a dark smudge on the crisp, watermarked paper. He held it out to her. "I don't want it." Margot didn't take it. "Don't be a martyr, Finch. It's $100,000. You sweep floors for a living. You wear a polyester jumpsuit. That piece of paper buys you a house in a state where it doesn't rain 9 months out of the year. It buys you retirement. Take the money." "No." "Why?" The word snapped out of her, louder than she intended. The sheer, irrational defiance of it made her blood run hot. Because of some archaic sense of blue-collar pride? You think turning down my money makes you morally superior? Finch sighed. He let the check drop onto the table. He folded his pocket knife with a soft click and slid it into his pocket. You don't listen, do you? Finch said, leaning back in the cheap plastic chair. It groaned under his weight. You're so used to buying your way out of corners, you don't even know what to do when the register is closed. I didn't fix your car for money. I fixed it because the machine was suffering. It was built to run, and those idiots you hired were suffocating it with math. It bothered me. That's it. Everything has a price, maybe in your building, Finch said, pointing a finger upward toward the ceiling. Up there, everything's a transaction. Down here, sometimes a thing is just broken, and a man fixes it, because he knows how. I told you what my price was. Margot crossed her arms. Her fingernails dug into the fabric of her sleeves. A mop bucket, a yellow bucket, with a silent front left caster wheel. Finch confirmed, completely deadpan. This one sounds like a dying rat every time I push it down the north corridor. Drives me up the wall. Margot stared at him. She looked at his lined face, the grey stubble on his jaw, the absolute calm in his pale blue eyes. He was immovable. He was the rigid aerospace-grade alloy, and she was the vibration trying to tear the joint apart. She realized, with a sudden sinking weight in her stomach, that she couldn't buy her way out of this room. She reached out and snatched the check off the table. She tore it cleanly in half, then in quarters. She dropped the pieces into the plastic trash can next to his chair. Fine, Margot said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. You don't want my money, but you're going to get in that car. Finch raised an eyebrow. What? You resurrected it. Now you're going to feel what it actually does. My garage. 10 minutes. She turned on her heel and walked out, letting the heavy door slam shut behind her. The garage vault was still bitterly cold. The 1957 Ferrari sat in the center of the white epoxy floor, looking like a drop of fresh blood on a surgical table. Finch walked out of the service elevator exactly 10 minutes later. He had taken off his grey coveralls. He wore a faded flannel shirt and a pair of worn denim jeans. He still carried the smell of industrial cleaner. Margot was already in the driver's seat. The engine was running. It wasn't sputtering. It was holding a terrifying, thunderous idol that vibrated the concrete floor beneath their feet. The smell of rich, leaded exhaust fumes was already thick in the air. Finch walked over to the passenger side. There was no exterior door handle. He reached inside the window, pulled the metal latch, and dropped into the low, unforgiving bucket seat. The leather was stiff and smelled of ancient dust. There were no seatbelts. Margot didn't look at him. Her hands gripped the wooden steering wheel. Her jaw was set. She slammed the heavy gated shifter into first gear with a loud metallic clack. She dumped the clutch. The rear tires screamed against the epoxy. The car violently lunged forward, throwing Finch hard against the back of his seat. Margot didn't brake for the exit ramp. She kept her foot planted. The V12 engine howled, echoing off the narrow, spiraling concrete tunnel as they rocketed upward toward street level. They burst out of the underground garage and onto the wet, neon-lit streets of downtown Seattle. It was a machine built for a track in Italy in 1957, not for stop-and-go traffic in a damp American city. It fought her every second. There was no power steering. Every time Margot turned the wheel, the muscles in her forearms bunched and strained against the heavy mechanical resistance of the front tires. The clutch pedal required 50 pounds of pressure to depress. The brakes were heavy drums that demanded brute force to stop the momentum of the steel chassis. The car was hot. Heat bled through the thin firewall, baking their legs. The exhaust note was deafening inside the cabin, drowning out the sounds of the city entirely. It smelled of hot oil, raw gasoline, and burning clutch friction material. Margot's palms were sweating. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She had to double clutch every downshift, blipping the throttle to match the engine speed to the transmission, or the gears would grind with a sickening crunch. She missed the shift into second. The gearbox snarled in protest. She cursed sharply, fought the lever, and slammed it home. Finch winced at the sound, but he didn't say a word. He just held onto the leather door strap, his eyes watching the dashboard gauges jump and twitch with the engine's vibration. Margot steered them onto the on-ramp for Interstate 90, heading east across the floating bridge. The rain had stopped, but the asphalt was black and slick, reflecting the headlights of oncoming traffic like shattered glass. She pushed the throttle to the floor. The response was instantaneous and violent. The heavy car squatted on its rear suspension and surged forward. The speedometer needle swept past 60, then 80, then 100. The wind noise was brutal, tearing through the gaps in the poorly sealed windows. The whole chassis shuddered. This wasn't the insulated, detached speed of a modern luxury sedan. This was raw, terrifying kinetic energy. The steering wheel kicked violently against her palms, a harsh vibration traveling up her forearms into her teeth. She could feel every groove in the pavement, every pebble, every imperfection in the road translated directly through the suspension into her spine. She hadn't been afraid in a decade. She felt fear now. It tasted metallic in the back of her throat. One mistake, a patch of standing water, a slight overcorrection on the heavy steering wheel, and the $2 million machine would snap loose, spinning them into the concrete median in a fireball of Italian aluminum and high-octane fuel. She glanced sideways at Finch. He wasn't terrified. He was leaning his head back against the seat, his eyes half closed. He was listening. He was riding the wave of the mechanical noise. "Still running a little rich on cylinder 8, he yelled over the screaming wind and the engine roar. "Carb needs leaning out a quarter turn," Margot barked a laugh. It was a sharp, genuine sound that shocked her. She kept her foot down. 110 miles an hour. 120. The engine didn't cough. The cheap 50-cent brass fitting held tight, absorbing the violent harmonic vibrations of the screaming V12. The fuel flowed. The fire burned. The machine was alive. For the first time in 5 years, Margot Hayes wasn't thinking about supply chains or board members or leverage. She was entirely, desperately focused on keeping a piece of metal moving in a straight line. The car demanded absolute presence. It punished distraction with death. She felt a heavy, suffocating weight lift off her chest. They drove for an hour, tearing through the dark, empty stretches of the highway. the exhaust note echoing off the pine trees lining the road. By the time Margot finally exited the highway and began the slow, jarring drive back into the city, her arms were trembling from the physical exertion. Her right calf was cramped from the heavy throttle pedal. Her expensive charcoal blazer smelled permanently like exhaust fumes. She navigated back down the spiral ramp, the tires squealing softly on the wet concrete, and pulled the Ferrari back into the center of the underground vault. She turned the key off. The silence rushed back in, heavy and ringing. The engine ticked loudly as the hot metal began to cool and contract. The smell of hot brakes filled the sterile room. Margot sat still, her chest heaving slightly, her hands still gripping the wooden wheel. She let go, her fingers uncurling slowly. They were stiff. She looked at Finch. Finch unlatched the door and pushed it open. He climbed out slowly, his knees popping in the quiet garage. He stretched his back, running a hand over his grey hair. "Ride's rough," he said casually. "Suspension's too stiff for these roads. You're gonna rattle your teeth out of your skull." Margot rested her forehead against the steering wheel. She let out a long, slow breath. "It's perfect." "It ain't perfect," Finch said. "It's a machine. It's gonna break again. You just gotta know how to listen to it when it does." He turned and walked toward the service elevator. He didn't ask for a ride home. He didn't ask for a thank you. He just walked away, the heavy canvas tool bag absent from his shoulder tonight. Margot stayed in the car for a long time. She listened to the tink-tink-tink of the cooling manifolds. Monday morning arrived with the sterile efficiency that defined Margot's empire. At 7 a.m., the sub-basement maintenance room was quiet. Thomas Finch punched his time card into the heavy mechanical clock. It bit the cardboard with a loud shuck-chunk. He walked over to his corner of the room, expecting to grab his scarred yellow mop bucket and begin the endless loop of the north corridor. He stopped. The bucket was sitting where he left it. But it looked different. Finch knelt down. The squeaky, rusty front left caster wheel was gone. In its place was a piece of master-machined engineering. It was a massive, sealed bearing assembly, cast from matte gray aerospace grade billet aluminum. It looked incredibly out of place on the cheap yellow plastic bucket, like bolting a jet turbine to a lawnmower. It was secured perfectly with custom-threaded titanium bolts. Finch reached out with one heavily scarred finger and pushed the bucket. It rolled across the grit-covered concrete floor. It didn't make a sound. It was dead silent. The bearing spun with zero friction, absorbing the imperfections of the floor perfectly. Next to the bucket, resting on the floor, was a small, smudged piece of white paper. Finch picked it up. It was the torn corner of the cashier's check from Friday. Written on the back in sharp, elegant black ink were two words: "Debt paid." Finch looked at the beautifully over-engineered caster wheel. He looked at the torn piece of paper. Slowly, the corners of his mouth twitched upward, pulling the deep wrinkles of his face into a rare, genuine smile. He grabbed the handle of the mop bucket. He pushed it toward the door, enjoying the absolute, pristine silence of the heavy, rolling rubber. 6 stories above him, Margot Hayes sat in her glass office. She was reviewing a hostile takeover proposal for a competitor in Singapore. Her phone was ringing. Her inbox was overflowing. The city below was humming with commerce and friction. She ignored the spreadsheet on her monitor. She reached out and touched her fingernails. There was a thin crescent of black grease permanently embedded under her right index fingernail. She had spent 20 minutes scrubbing it with a bristle brush on Sunday morning, but it wouldn't come out. The old brass fitting had left its mark. Margot didn't hide her hand. She pressed her thumb against the grease stain, feeling the slight grit of the oil. She looked out over the city, the corners of her mouth tightening, and got back to work. If this story made you feel something real, don't just scroll past. We tell raw, unfiltered stories about the grit behind the glory, the people hiding in the shadows of success, and the machines that break us. Hit that subscribe button right now. Like this video to feed the algorithm, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that the best things in life can't be bought on a spreadsheet. Drop a comment below. What's your $2 million Ferrari?